The strong shall rule the weak, and the weak shall serve the strong. The iron heel is coming. That line wasn't pulled from some modern dystopian series on Netflix. It was written in 1908 by Jack London in a novel called The Iron Heel. Most people today remember London, if at all, for The Call of the Wild or White Fang, stories about endurance and survival in the natural world. But The Iron Heel is about survival in the social world, a world where predators wear suits and sit in boardrooms. London saw what was coming. He saw capitalism mutating from a rough-and-tumble competitive system into something colder, more deliberate, a merger of wealth and political power that would crush dissent under its boot, literally its iron heel. He wasn't warning about some distant totalitarian future. He was describing a process already underway in 1908. The industrial monopolies, the private armies breaking strikes, the newspapers owned by the same men who owned the factories. He looked around at the early 20th century and saw the outlines of something permanent taking shape, a self-reinforcing elite that controlled the means of production, the levers of government, and the narrative itself. His message was simple. When wealth becomes power, and power becomes absolute, democracy becomes a decoration. And here we are, 117 years later, standing on eerily familiar ground. We like to think that history moves in straight lines, that we progress through eras, each better than the last. But history is circular, and the wheel seems to have rolled right back to London's time. Once again, a handful of individuals control more wealth than entire nations. Once again, the media is concentrated in a few corporate hands. Once again, labor is treated as a cost to be minimized, not a class of citizens to be dignified. The numbers tell the story. In the United States today, the top 0.1% owns roughly as much as the bottom 90%. That's not democracy. That's feudalism with better branding. London called it an oligarchy. Today, we call it the market, efficiency, growth. We've changed the words, but not the structure. We still bow before the same altar, only the priests have traded their top hats for hoodies and startup valuations. Political corruption? We've normalized it. Lobbying isn't bribery, it's access. Campaign donations aren't influence buying. They're free speech. We've legalized the iron heel, codified it, marketed it. And yet, London's real warning wasn't just about money. It was about memory. About how easily people forget what freedom actually means once they're convinced that safety, comfort, or convenience are more important. In the iron heel, the masses don't rise up overnight. They adjust, they rationalize. They tell themselves the oligarchy is necessary, that without the captains of industry, chaos would reign. Sound familiar? We hear it every day. Don't tax the job creators. Don't regulate innovation. Don't question the system. You'll crash it. London saw that line of thinking as the first symptom of surrender. Over a century later, that same surrender is everywhere. In our politics, in our media, in the way we talk about inequality as if it's an act of nature, not a design. And what makes it worse is that most people don't even realize they've stopped questioning it. So when we read The Iron Heel today, we shouldn't see it as some dusty socialist tract from another age. We should see it for what it is, a mirror. And what it reflects is uncomfortable. Because the question isn't whether Jack London was right. The question is, have we been paying attention? Or have we been too busy scrolling, streaming, and consuming to notice that the iron heel never left? It just learned to smile for the cameras. The iron heel isn't science fiction in the sense we use the term today. There are no robots, no space travel, no futuristic technologies. What makes it chilling is how recognizable it feels, because it's built out of the things that were already happening. The novel opens not with fantasy, but with realism. The working class beginning to organize, intellectuals questioning the moral legitimacy of capitalism, and a society starting to realize that freedom meant very little when survival itself was a privilege. London gives us Ernest Everhart, a fiery socialist orator who dares to speak truth to wealth. Through him, London articulates his own anger at a system that preaches liberty while producing poverty. But London doesn't make Everhart a hero who triumphs. Instead, he becomes a martyr, a man who saw what was coming but couldn't stop it. The story is framed as a found manuscript, written by Everhart's wife, Avis, and discovered centuries later in a future where humanity is finally broken free of the Iron Heel's rule. This structure does something brilliant. It makes the entire book feel like a recovered warning, a record of how democracy was lost, written by somebody who lived through its fall. And it's not a sudden collapse. That's what makes it believable. The Iron Heel doesn't storm the gates with soldiers. It creeps in through institutions, through the courts, the banks, the press. It wins hearts first, then minds, then laws. It convinces ordinary people that subservience is rational, even patriotic. London wasn't imagining this out of thin air. He was describing what he saw around him in 1908, a country where industry was booming, but the benefits weren't shared. The U.S. Steel Trust, Standard Oil, and the rail monopolies dominated every sector. Factory workers toiled 12 hours a day for starvation wages, while their employers lived like kings. Child labor was common. 6-year-olds in coal mines, 8-year-olds in textile mills. Company towns controlled every aspect of life. You worked for the company, lived in their housing, bought food from their store, and owed your wages back to the same employer. That wasn't employment, it was economic servitude. It's how the aristocracy built London, the town, not the person. When workers fought back through unions, strikes, and protests, they were met not with negotiation, but with violence. Private militias like the Pinkertons were hired to break strikes, infiltrate labor groups, and, when necessary, kill. The government, which should have protected its citizens, often sided with capital. Judges issued injunctions against labor organizing. Police cracked skulls. Newspapers, owned by industrialists, called the strikers anarchists and criminals. London saw this wasn't a collection of isolated abuses. It was the architecture of something larger, a system that combined economic power, political influence, and control of information. A system that could call itself free while systematically crushing dissent. That's the Iron Heel. Not a single dictator, but a collective, an alliance of the corporate and the state, each protecting the other from accountability. And here's the dark genius of it. They didn't justify it with cruelty. They justified it with stability. They promised order, prosperity, progress, all the things people wanted to believe in. And they made sure that those who benefited most were the ones telling the story. The strong shall rule the weak, they said. Not out loud, but through policy, through ownership, through quiet coercion dressed as logic. In London's world, democracy doesn't die because people hated it. It dies because people were persuaded that it's inefficient, that it's messy, that the experts, the managers, the captains of industry should be left alone to run things. Once the Iron Heel takes hold, the rest happens slowly, like rust. Elections continue, but the choice is narrow. Laws exist, but they don't serve those who wrote them. Speech is still free-ish, but only the powerful have a platform. By the time the masses realize what's happened, It's too late. And that's the brilliance and terror of London's insight. He didn't imagine a dictatorship imposed from above. He imagined one invented from below. A society so tired of chaos that it accepts control. So fearful of instability that it trades away liberty for security. So convinced that the system is self-correcting that it doesn't notice when the correction stops. The Iron Heel wasn't a machine. It was a mindset. And once that mindset spreads, resistance looks naive, even dangerous. Now look around today. The tools have changed. Social media instead of newspapers. Algorithms instead of Pinkertons. But the logic is the same. We are being told, once again, that the system knows best. That dissent is disorder. That questioning power makes you radical. London's world may have been fiction, but his vision was diagnostic. He wasn't trying to entertain. He was trying to warn. And what he warned against wasn't a single tyrant or ideology. It was complacency. The willingness of society to mistake comfort for freedom and hierarchy for stability. Sound familiar? If London's Iron Heel was a warning about the consolidation of wealth and power, then today the warning lights are flashing brighter than ever. Let's start with wealth itself. America's economic inequality has surpassed even the Gilded Age, the period London was writing about. Today, the top 0.1% own as much as the entire bottom 90% combined. That's not abstract statistics. That's a literal concentration of economic control in the hands of a few families, a few corporations, a few people whose decisions ripple across millions of lives. And it's not just about money. Corporate consolidation now permeates every sector. Food production, distribution, and retail are dominated by a handful of conglomerates. Media, television, online news, even social media platforms are concentrated in the hands of a few executives who control what billions see, hear, and believe. Healthcare is dictated by giant insurers and pharmaceutical companies. Housing is shaped by massive real estate investors, rather than neighborhoods or local governments. Technology, from search engines to app stores to AI, is largely centralized. Every aspect of daily life is filtered through corporate pipelines that answer first to profit, second to regulation, and last to citizens. Politics has been little more than theater for these interests. Campaigns are funded by billionaires whose donations can dwarf entire city budgets. Laws are written, lobbied, and passed in ways that overwhelmingly benefit the wealthy. Elected officials, under pressure to fundraise or curry favor with donors, often serve their sponsors rather than their constituents. Democracy exists, but like London's Iron Heel, it's dressed up in form and procedure, while the substance is quietly stripped away. Meanwhile, the people who London imagined as the backbone of resistance, the workers, are under pressure in ways both subtle and brutal. Stagnant wages leave families unable to build wealth or plan for the future. Gig economies provide flexibility but no stability or benefits. Automation increases efficiency and profits, but those gains are captured almost entirely by shareholders and executives. Workers aren't just laboring. They're competing for scraps in a system designed to make them dependent and replaceable. And the tools of power aren't always visible. In London's day, suppression came in the form of the Pinkertons and strikebreakers. Today, it comes in quiet legal mechanisms, restrictive voting laws, licensing requirements, arbitration clauses that prevent class action lawsuits, and intellectual property monopolies that favor entrenched firms. Militarized policing, surveillance, and regulatory pressure serve the same function, controlling dissent and discouraging collective action. The warning signs London identified aren't theoretical. They're front-page news. We see billion-dollar lobbying networks shaping laws, book bans and censorship campaigns controlling education, and protests met with force. Each incident alone might seem small, but together they form a pattern. A society where power is centralized, dissent is contained, and legal systems reinforce rather than challenge inequality. What's particularly insidious is the normalization of this power. When billionaires dictate policy, when corporations shape culture, when labor is restricted in the name of efficiency, we don't just call it an iron heel. We call it the way things are. We call it progress. We tell ourselves there's nothing we can do. The system is too complex. The market will correct itself. And that's precisely the danger London foresaw. The iron heel doesn't need to scream. It doesn't need to declare itself. It arrives quietly, bureaucratically, legally. It becomes the default. And by the time the majority notices, the structures are entrenched. Resistance seems futile. Compliance appears rational. Look at how the headlines read today. Billions in lobbying influence. Corporate mergers approved with little oversight. Cities where rents are rising faster than wages. Protesters criminalized for exercising their rights. Educational content challenged or rewritten for ideological conformity. Surveillance technologies that track citizens under the guise of safety. The iron heel is everywhere, not as overt dictatorship, but as a system of incentives, laws, and norms that privilege the powerful. It's quiet, it's legal, it's bureaucratic, and it's happening right now. So why are we ignoring the warnings? Why does London's century-old insight still feel like a prophecy nobody wants to admit is real? The first reason is confidence, or maybe accurately, overconfidence. We tell ourselves it can't happen here, that the United States is exceptional, that our Constitution, our institutions, our traditions somehow make us immune to the patterns that felled other civilizations. History says otherwise. Every empire that believed itself exceptional, Rome, Ming China, Byzantium, even 20th century democracies like Weimar Germany, eventually fell under the control of the few. The lesson is clear. Power concentrates, institutions erode, and societies delude themselves into believing the collapse is impossible. We're no different. And then there's complacency. Modern life has lulled us into mistaking comfort for safety. We assume that because we can order food, stream entertainment, and swipe a card, that the world is stable. But comfort is not freedom. Convenience is not democracy. Just because we can navigate daily life doesn't mean we control it. Distraction is another ally of the iron heel. Social media, endless content, 24-hour news cycles. All of it fragments attention and amplifies trivialities. While the system quietly consolidates power, most of us are consumed by outrage over a headline or scrolling past the very story that documents the erosion of rights. London understood this principle intuitively. The iron heel doesn't need to shout. It can flourish in the background while people focus on entertainment, celebrity, or outrage theater. And then there's skepticism towards the truth itself. In a society where profits and influence dominate, alarmists and critics are dismissed as radicals, extremists, or conspiracy theorists. London experienced this firsthand. His warnings about oligarchic consolidation, the suppression of labor, and the erosion of democratic institutions were considered fringe, even dangerous at the time. Yet, he saw the pattern clearly. He knew that when a society prioritizes profit over people, democracy becomes decoration. Think about it. Democratic rituals continue. Elections are held, debates broadcast, votes counted. But the underlying mechanics of influence are skewed. Power is packaged in ways that appear legitimate, even fair. People believe they have a voice, but that voice is diluted, filtered, or drowned out by money, media control, and legal manipulation. It's not that people are ignorant. Most people see inequality, political dysfunction, or corporate overreach. But seeing isn't the same as believing. There's a psychological barrier. If the truth is too disturbing, too overwhelming, it becomes easier to rationalize it away. This is the way the world works. Nothing can change. We are powerless. These mantras are modern anesthesia, allowing society to endure the iron heel without actively resisting. And society reinforces itself. People fear being labeled radical, ostracized, or punished for speaking out. The very culture of caution, of keeping your head down, protects the system. Those who question, critique, or resist become marginalized, while those who comply thrive, even superficially. Over time, the culture of obedience, of passive acceptance, becomes self-perpetuating. In London's novel, this is exactly what happens. Resistance exists, but it is isolated, uncoordinated, and easily suppressed. People see injustice, yet they rationalize inaction. They claim the oligarchy is inevitable, rational, even beneficial. Democracy, once alive and vibrant, becomes a ritual without meaning. And this is the danger we face today. We mistake protest for noise, dissent for disorder, and warning signs for exaggeration. We assume that because our systems are complex, because our societies are technologically advanced, because we have wealth and innovation, the iron heel cannot take root. But London understood that it isn't about technology or wealth. It's about values. It's about whether society prioritizes human dignity, equality, and justice over profit and power. When profit is supreme, democracy is merely a stage set, elaborate, convincing, and ultimately hollow. So, why aren't we listening? Because it's uncomfortable to confront. Because acknowledging it means accepting responsibility for ourselves, for our society, for our institutions. Because truth demands action, and action requires courage. In other words, we're not listening because it's easier to believe that the problem is somewhere else, in those people, those politicians, those corporations. Not here, not now, not in our time. But history and London remind us the iron heel doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, methodically. It thrives where the people believe it cannot exist. If there's one thing that distinguishes Jack London's The Iron Heel from the typical dystopian fiction, it's that it doesn't end with triumph. There's no heroic last-minute revolt, no magical restoration of democracy. What it does end with is suppression. And yet, in that suppression, there's something more enduring. Memory. The knowledge of what was lost. The record of injustice. The testimony of those who resisted. That, London tells us, is where hope begins. Not in naive optimism, not in illusions of inevitable victory, but in awareness. Awareness is the seed of resistance. So, what does awareness demand of us? How do we translate knowledge that the iron heel can exist into action that prevents it from taking root? First, we must recommit to education. Not the kind designed to produce rote memorization or test scores. Not the kind that teaches obedience, but the kind that teaches critical thinking, historical perspective, and moral reasoning. Education must be about more than career preparation. It must be about civic preparation, about recognizing patterns of oppression, questioning authority, and understanding that democracy is fragile, not guaranteed. When society forgets history, it repeats it. When it stops questioning power, power shapes reality unchecked. Second, we must rebuild the social contract. In London's vision, the Iron Heel thrived because society prioritized profit over people, efficiency over dignity. Today, we see the consequences in stagnant wages, insecure labor, unaffordable housing, and healthcare that treats people as liabilities instead of human beings. Rebuilding the social contract means creating systems that prioritize labor, fairness, and human dignity. It means ensuring that work is valued, that citizens are empowered, and that economic systems serve society, not the other way around. It's about making the invisible principles of justice visible in policy, in law, and in everyday life. Third, we must break the fusion of corporate and state power before it hardens completely. The Iron Heel thrives on legitimacy, legal, bureaucratic, cultural. Once society permits that concentration of corporate and governmental power, resistance becomes exponentially harder. This isn't just about campaign finance reform or antitrust laws, though those are important. It's about designing institutions that are resilient, decentralized, and accountable. Structures where power is diffuse enough that it cannot be weaponized against the populace without consequence. Where oversight is real, not performative. Where rules are enforced fairly, consistently, and transparently. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, we must understand that democracy is not self-sustaining. It is not a gift, a permanent condition, or a system that automatically corrects its own failures. Democracy is a living, ongoing act of will, something that must be nurtured, defended, and renewed constantly. If citizens disengage, if vigilance wanes, if values of equality and accountability are allowed to erode, oligarchies take root naturally. The Iron Heel is not a foreign invader. It is a product of inattention and apathy. Resistance does not always look dramatic. It doesn't always involve protest signs or marches. It often begins quietly, in conversations, in reading, in questioning, in teaching the next generation to think for themselves, rather than accept the narrative handed down by the powerful. Awareness begets discussion. Discussion begets action. And action, small, persistent, and coordinated, builds pressure against entrenched power. Remember, London's message was clear. The Iron Heel can be defeated, but only if society recognizes its existence and refuses to accept it as inevitable. Memory, awareness, and deliberate action are our most potent tools. So what do we do in practical terms? We engage with history and contemporary analysis. We understand how patterns of oppression emerge, how wealth concentrates, and how institutions can be captured. We teach and practice critical thinking in our homes, our schools, and our communities. We question the narratives presented as neutral or factual, including this one. We support systems that distribute power, economic, political, social, in ways that prioritize human dignity and prevent consolidation of control. We participate actively in democracy. We vote, we advocate, we monitor, and we hold those accountable. Citizenship is not a passive role. Recognizing that resistance can be both individual and collective. Small actions accumulate. Speaking out, educating others, and making informed decisions chip away at the structures of entrenched power. Ultimately, London's cautionary tale is also a call to arms. Not with weapons, but with intellect, ethics, and civic courage. Awareness alone is not enough, but it is the indispensable first step. Once we see the Iron Heel clearly, we can refuse to let it crush us underfoot. Democracy survives only if we refuse to treat it as inevitable, only if we act consistently and intelligently to preserve it. Only if we remember and teach others to remember that freedom is a practice, not a guarantee. That is how we honor London's warning. That is how we take the first step towards a society where power serves the people, not the other way around. Jack London's The Iron Heel was written not as a prophecy, but as a history from a future that didn't have to happen. It was a cautionary manuscript, a warning etched in fiction but grounded in reality, a vision of what occurs when greed consolidates into power, when society forgets its own values, and when democracy becomes a decorative stage set rather than a living practice. The tragedy is that we've done almost everything imaginable to make that future possible. The consolidation of wealth, the fusion of corporate and state power, the erosion of labor protections, the distraction of the populace, the normalization of inequality. All of it has unfolded almost exactly as London feared. And yet somehow we still believe it can't happen here, asked Sinclair Lewis. We have the institutions, the knowledge, the history, and the technology to prevent it. Yet the very warning signs that London highlighted, suppression of dissent, manipulation of the narrative, legal and bureaucratic reinforcement of power, are now ordinary headlines. They don't shock us anymore. They barely stir us. The Iron Heel doesn't have to march in with boots on the street. It advances quietly, invisibly, legally. And we, in our comfort and distraction, often let it pass. London framed this story as an historical record from the future because he wanted readers to see the consequences of inaction. And that framing is just as urgent today. If the last century was a warning, then the next one will be the verdict. Will we look back and see how we failed to act? Or will we recognize that awareness and effort can still alter the outcome? The tools of change are still within our grasp. Critical thinking, civic engagement, protection of labor and social systems, vigilance against consolidation of power. These are not abstract ideals. They are the levers that can prevent the Iron Heel from becoming permanent. They are the reminders that democracy, like life, is not self-sustaining. It must be actively nurtured every day. And so the question is no longer about whether the Iron Heel exists. The question is whether we, collectively, are ready to act. Will we choose awareness over ignorance, courage over comfort, action over resignation? Will we honor London's warning by not despairing, but by engaging, by teaching, by challenging the systems that threaten to crush us underfoot? The verdict is not written. It is ours to decide. And the only question left is, are we finally ready to listen? Because if we do, if we truly listen, we can take the first step towards a society where freedom, justice, and dignity are not mere words, but lived reality. And if we don't, then Jack London's warning will have become history. A history of a future that we could have prevented.